Go. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Doctoring Duo podcast, where you have two medical students giving honest, unfiltered advice and opinions about medical school and the application process directly to you, interested listeners and hopeful pre-meds. As a reminder, my name is Eleni. I'm an MS1 at Penn State College of Medicine. I don't speak for my institution, I only speak for myself.
Hey everyone, I'm Noah. I'm a first year medical student at Mayo Clinic Alex School of Medicine, and my opinions are my own and not those of Mayo Clinic.
All right, and today's topic is going to be, well, this is going to be a little bit short of an episode. I know we've hit you guys with some longer ones for the past couple months, but I think this one is an important one, and an important one for around this time of year, especially for those of you considering applying in the next upcoming cycle, and that's letters of recommendation. Um, so kind of a briefer episode. We're going to go through what you need to know about letters of recommendation, who to ask, how to ask, and when to ask, and we'll kind of hopefully give you some advice on the process. So how many letters do you need, I guess, is the first question.
Yeah. So this is like probably the number one question that a lot of people have when you're first starting out and you're researching about letters of recommendation. The typical guideline is that you need 3 individual letters or 1 committee letter. At William and Mary, my undergraduate institution, we didn't have a pre-medical committee. We only had a pre-medical advisor. So all of my letters were individual. I solicited those with professors who I felt I knew well. And I also got my pre-med advisor to write me one as well. So again, no committee. That's just how I did it.
Yeah, UVA, which was my undergrad, also had no committee. If you do have a committee, it is important to make sure that you get that letter ahead of time. I've heard of committees that can take up to 6 months to get those letters out. So make sure you're checking on that, even in your junior year of college, I would say, and making sure that you're getting that letter. My understanding of committee letters is that typically if you make a baseline, that they will give you a general letter of recommendation. And it's just to say, hey, you're generally competent. You're not graduating with a subpar GPA, and that your MCAT is suitable. I know there's cutoffs for a lot of schools, and that's going to vary from school to school. So make sure to check your school's website. I also had to get individual letters. I think I got about 7 to 8 individual letters. I got a lot.
Yeah, no, that's a lot.
How
Yeah,
many did you get?
interesting. Let me see. I had I had 4 professors and then my pre-med advisor, so I got 5 in total.
Okay. Let me see. Let me see. So the best way to manage your letters is through this thing called Interfolio, in my opinion. Yeah, I paid for the premium subscription for 1 year. Do remember to cancel it if you're not going to use it anymore. That was
Yeah,
one thing
please remember to cancel it. I think they even email you, which is really nice.
yeah, well, I ignore the email. Um, so yeah, let me see. Oh my gosh, I got one, two, three, four, five, six, seven. Yeah, 8 letters of recommendation.
Okay.
And that was in part because I added a couple schools late and then they had different letter of recommendation requirements and I thought they did. And I thought my PI was an MD when it turns out he was a PhD, which was a little bit of confusion for me. So I got his letter and then I had to go get another letter from an MD who was one of the residents that I work with. And then I asked 2 chemistry teachers for a letter of recommendation because one wasn't responding and then he ended up responding. And so now I have 2 letters of recommendation from chemistry teachers. So I had a lot of letters, but I think that it was really good to work with. On some schools, I just sent all of them to, and I'm like, you're going to read all my letters. I think that having more is better than having less because, for example, I applied to Hackensack Meridian School of Medicine, which is a newer school in New Jersey, and I believe they were the ones that required an MD letter. And I did not have an MD letter. As I said, I thought my PI was an MD, not a PhD. And so I kind of was scrambling to go get that. And then I ended up adding another school that wanted an MD letter. And I was like, oh, awesome. I already have that. So just keep that in mind. I think New York Medical College also had one that was like, you need to have one from someone who's specifically in your major. And I have a weird major. So that kind of made things difficult. So just kind of keep eyes on the schools that you want to apply to, and make sure that you're meeting those requirements.
Yeah, no, for sure. That's good advice. I think as far, I'll give some detail about my letters as well. I had 5 letters. Let me see. One came from my human physiology professor. One came from my molecular biology professor. I had one from I was a psychology major, so my major advisor. And then it was a really fun class, literature and the Bible. So it was a little interesting. It was from the humanities side. So I thought that was a cool letter to add. And then, like I said, my pre-med advisor. I do agree with Lenny that having more rather than less is helpful. I would at least have a couple. So generally the minimum is 3. I would get, like I did, like 5 or 6, just in case. And also keep in mind, like Lenny said, like the special requirements. I didn't apply to any schools that required an MD or DO letter, but those schools do exist. So just make sure you do your research.
Mhm. And so I think you also brought up a good point. I think it's a really good idea to have a letter from. So I think like the rule of thumb is have one from a bio professor, have one from a chem professor, and then I would have at least one from a humanities professor because I think that's like it shows that it's like the holistic humanistic thing that
Yeah.
everyone's kind of moving towards is that you can be well-rounded. And I think I'm trying to see. Um, oh, I had one from one of my public health professors, so that was kind of like my humanities letter. Um, so letters from employers also work too. I got
Yeah.
one from I was a calculus TA for a while, and the professor who was supervising me wrote me a letter, and that's also good because it shows that like you're functional in the workplace and that you show up to work on time, that kind of thing. Like even if you were a server or something like that, like I remember interviewing at West Virginia and they loved that. They were asking me about being a waitress and all that stuff. So if you did it, put
Yeah.
it down.
Yeah, no, I think letters from different areas of your life is certainly helpful. I think even like a sports letter or athletics or, like you
Mm-hmm.
said, a workplace, those all look favorably. You just don't need college professors. The reason why we've kind of centered around academics is a lot of the schools explicitly state academic, but I do think it's really neat if you have a letter from an extracurricular that you did, a sport, a job. Those are all great letters too.
Yeah,
That show a different
absolutely.
side that the schools don't get to see.
Yeah. Um, yeah, and even like volunteer coordinators as well. Like I think I listed a volunteer coordinator as a reference, and that's actually something to keep in mind as well. That like you may not ask everyone for a letter of recommendation, but you might ask people to be like references for your activities. So make sure you're on good terms with those you do extracurricular activities with, because it is polite to ask them before you put them on their application. In the case that someone gives them a phone call and is like, "Hey, did Noah volunteer here?" And it's not a good look if they're like, "Who's Noah?" or "No."
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a good point. Like sort of tangential to the letter issue. Yeah, exactly. When you write your letters, your work and activity section, rather, I'm sorry, I misspoke. You put down a reference, and yeah, I would say it is good form to, let people know. It's pretty rare, I think, from what I've heard, but sometimes schools or AMCAS might call to verify that you actually did what you say you did.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think that's going to be a discussion for another day.
Yeah.
Um, so I think we kind of covered who you should ask. I think having kind of summing that up is a broad range of um, professors, making sure you're hitting those core science professors, and finding people who are willing to speak to your best. I think is really important. I know a lot of people who would like, oh, I'm going to go to my physics professor because that looks impressive, even though I don't know my physics professor. And it's like, it's okay to go to your intro bio professor if you guys were close. It's about who can speak to your abilities the best. Worry less about impressing. You can do that with your GPA and your MCAT.
Oh yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a very good point that I think is related to who do you ask. You do not need to ask um the professor emeritus of the organic chemistry department. you can ask like whoever knows you best and who can really speak to your work ethic, your individual strengths as a student, as a person. And if you're somebody who really went to this certain professor's TA office hours, or you spent extra time after work making sure that this thing goes smoothly for the next day, like people who can speak to your ability to go above and beyond and speak to your strengths is really useful rather than somebody who just writes a generic letter because they have impressive credentials.
Hmm. Yeah. And also don't think like, oh, they're not a professor, and then be like, oh, well, I don't think that's valid. Like, even if it's like, for example, I worked, you remember Horizons, Noah?
Yes, I do remember her.
Yeah, it was a nonprofit, with working with a lot of underserved students. Like I worked with a lot of school teachers there, and like I got a recommendation letter from one of them, and like that was totally fine. So
Yeah.
cool. So I think the next big question that we need to address is, when should you ask?
Yeah, good question. This is another big question that's probably on the top of everybody's minds right about now as we record this episode near the end of January. So I think my general advice would be at least 1 month in advance, if not more. I asked, I think I asked in February or March, which is like 2, 3, 4 months before AMCAS opens, which is near the end of May. So I think that's a good timeline. I think as far as when not to ask is also just as important. I wouldn't ask during midterms or finals when professors aren't going to be thinking about writing really strong letters for students. They're thinking about all the papers that they need to grade. So I would just keep that in mind. As far as etiquette, um, you can send reminders. I would keep it, periodic. Like, so let's say you ask 2 months in advance. I think it's appropriate if you send a month reminder, then 2 weeks, and then maybe a week. And that might even be a little bit much. But just use your discretion and how much you know that professor. Don't be annoying, but reminders are useful for professors. They have a lot of people probably ask them for letters. They have a lot of things going on. They're teaching, they're doing research. So, just be mindful of what that professor is going through at the moment when you ask them for a letter. If you walk in, like say you ask in person and they're clearly busy or they're not in a good mood, maybe you want to ask them at a different time.
Yeah. Also make sure to give them like sufficient time. Like I've talked to a lot of people who are like, I asked them 3 days before the letter was due. And like I that is not enough time. Like I sometimes I take more than 3 days to answer emails, which is bad. And sometimes I take more than 3 days to answer text. No one knows that. Uh because he
Very
texts me. Um, but at least 1 month in advance, I think is a good rule of thumb. I asked 2 months in advance, and that's because I have anxiety about these sorts of things. And it was kind of like, I did was I asked them, and then I said, "Hey, like, are you okay with it?" And then they said yes. And then like a month later, I would send them all the stuff that, like for interfolio, right? Is that what it's called?
Yeah, interfolio.
Interfolio, yeah. Send them all that stuff and then kind of send reminder emails as it went on. And I got pretty much all of them in like at least a week before the opening of the AMCOS application. And I think that was a good timeline because you're gonna have so much stuff going on when your AMCOS actually opens that you're not going to be want to chasing your letter writers. So I would set a personal deadline for getting those letters in for the date of opening for AMCOS.
Right. Yeah. That would be a general goal. And like Eleni said, there's a lot of things that are going to happen once that application opens. You're going to be worried about your work and activity section, your personal statement, and putting all your grades, all your individual classes and grades, which is actually sort of a time suck. Um, I think you can be strategic as well if you want to give people enough time, knowing that AMCAS is going to take a while to process your application. I think I set their deadline as like June 15th, knowing I'm not going to get processed right away. So if you want to give people some breathing room and a couple of weeks into the summer months when they're not super busy to write your letter near the end of the semester, even though you asked pretty far in advance, I think that can be a nice thing to do as well.
Yeah. And in terms of reminder emails, I agree with the don't be annoying thing, but also don't like I think there's a good balance between it. And I think that sending increasingly frequent emails as you get closer, like I don't think it's wrong to send an email like 48 hours apart when you're getting the closer to the due date. But I wouldn't be emailing them every other week for two or every week for 2 months. I think that's a bit much. So kind of like I guess exponentially decrease that time.
Yeah,
Um,
I like that idea. I think that's perfectly appropriate. I think I'm not exactly sure how you handled it, and I'll let you speak to how you handle reminder emails. But I think for
mhm.
me, I don't think I personally had to reach out to any of my professors. If you get Interfolio and you pay for the premium, and it might even be free, I don't know, I'd have to check. But they actually will send emails too. So then you kind of have that nice feature where it's not Noah's emailing me again. It's like, oh, he's using the system, and it's just sending me a reminder email. And plus, it gives them a link to like upload it, so you're not having to write out these long emails and do it. And it sets it on a schedule too, and it becomes increasingly frequent. So you don't have to. Let's say you're like Eleni and you got 7 or 8 letters. You're not sending 7 or 8 emails every two, like every 2 or 3 days when it's getting to that time crunch of your deadline.
Also, don't be afraid to copy and paste, especially if they're in different departments. Um, I
Make sure you
copy and
have the right
pasted
name.
several. Yes, make sure you do have the right name. That is the worst thing ever. I think I did that once, but I knew the professor really, really well, and I was like, "Oh my God, so sorry, wrong person." Um, so make sure that you're doing the right name. Don't be like me. And just be nice. Don't be like, "Where is my letter?" It's like, "Hey, like just friendly reminder that it's coming due. Like, please let me know if I can provide you anything else." Sometimes they'll ask for your resumes, so make sure your resume is like prepared when you ask for letters. Make sure, like, I had several ask for transcripts, and I think it was to talk about the kind of student that I was, just like generally. And so, like, make sure you have that on hand and you can email that back quickly.
Yeah, in fact, I would even say if you really want to be on top of your game, and I think it sort of depends on the professor too and how well you know them. But if you actually have your transcript prepared, because unlike high school where a lot of teachers know your grades, that it's small enough where they have a good sense of who you are. At least for us, we went to a smaller high school. Um, but at college, nobody knows anybody's personal grades. So have your transcript. I think it's actually really nice, even if it's not completely done yet, to give them a copy of your personal statement. They can kind of speak because maybe you hadn't had sort of like that career talk with your professor, and they can get a sense of why do you want to be a physician, and that can be helpful to them as they write your letter. And then if you want them to speak to your working activities in a way that's different from from the own way that you verbalize it in your working activity section, you can give them a copy of your working activity section too. Um, I think it's really up to you and how much you want your letter writers to know about you and what you want them to write about. But I think those are just some extra tips if you want to do that.
Yeah, I think those are great tips. I think we've kind of beaten this subject to death. So, if there's nothing else you want to add, I think we can move on. Um, Actually, I think you know what? I think a good kind of interlude to this is, um, especially with COVID, I think that students really don't know how to ask. Um, and like you guys have to go to office hours. Like, oh, who do I ask? Who do I ask? I get letters from people that I took online only classes with because of COVID, and that was because I went to office hours and turned my camera on. Um, and I know it's annoying. I know it can make you seem like a gunner, and people are like, "Ew, you're a gunner," or whatever, because you're in office hours. But it's really, really important for them to know your name and know your face. I'm lucky because I have a very unique name and I have a very unique voice and kind of demeanor. Apparently, when I was an side note, when I was an RA, my residents would know it was me even if they didn't know what I was wearing that day, because they could tell by the way I walked. And I was like, that is slightly disturbing. So apparently I have a memorable walk, I think, which helped. But Noah, you have a very generic name. How did you make yourself stand out?
Yeah, no, that's a good question, actually. I think one of the one of the things that I certainly did to stand out, I think, I think it is important of you don't need to get to know every professor, but I think I'm gonna say the same thing, office hours, office hours, office hours. Um, for my major advisor, I would have regular conversations with her. If it was a professor, like my physiology professor, I took that class online. I would go to office hours, turn on my camera. He knows who I am. He knows or, that I ask thoughtful questions and I'm engaged in the class. Um, I think that's really the most important thing that you can do to stand out is to show your face and to show that you're engaged in the class. These people have had thousands of students over the course of their career. Nobody's going to remember that little square on the screen. I'm sorry, it's just it's not memorable. So you need to show up, you need to talk, and you need to actually meet with them.
Yeah. Raise your hand in class. Like don't be afraid to raise your hand in class. Like that's how they know your name. And like go like even so if you can't make the office hours, go after class. Like for 5 minutes, ask them a couple questions. I'm sure you have questions. I always had questions. And so that's also a good way to kind of get to know them. So even if you're online, there's no excuse. You can still bond with professors. It might be a little harder.
Yeah, and then also kind of building off that of exactly how do I ask, especially online. For online, this might be solved with you. If you've been taking predominantly online classes, they probably don't have in-person office hours, so you're gonna have to email them. But in I think Eleni and I's case, we had in-person for about half of our college career, and it kind of turned into all online and then like a hybrid. Um, I still think even for classes where it was predominantly in person, this is just my personal opinion. I think it's okay to send an email, as long as you're courteous and you're respectful. If it's been a while, like for one of my professors, it had been maybe a year or two since I had taken their class. In my introductory email asking for a letter, I included an anecdote about a moment that we had shared or something that I particularly liked about the class to jog their memory of me. I think that's really useful. Um, and then in person, obviously, is another way that you can go. I would schedule a meeting and just keep it short and sweet. It doesn't have to be this long oration about why you're the greatest student ever and why you need this letter. It's just, hi, I really enjoyed your class. Can you please write me a strong letter?
Usually they'll say yes if they're going to say something positive. Um, like don't go to a professor that you think hates you, but like I don't think anybody that would has nothing good to say. Like I emailed one professor. I think he just didn't remember me because I was in his intro bio class and he just didn't respond. And I was like, okay, you know what? It's maybe it's better that way. Um, yeah. So I think kind of we can start moving towards wrapping this conversation up just by a little bit of logistics. So the way I did it was I had it sent through Interfolio. So your AMCOS application has like an ID tied to it, and like you can input that ID and like it'll automatically get electronically sent to AMCOS. I think if you pay for premium, which again I think is worth it because it's a huge headache otherwise. I don't know how you did it, Noah.
Yeah, I also did it through Interfolio, and you're exactly right. It's the paid feature. Each letter I think counts as one of your deliveries, and I think you pay like 40 or $50 for 40 or 50 deliveries, which is overkill, but um regardless, you need that if you want to use Interfolio to store your letters and then send it to Ampcast. The other potential option that you have, this is how most people probably do it who haven't heard of Interfolio. Um, there, what you're gonna have to end up doing is I think your professor, whoever's uploading your letter, has to make an AMCAS account, and then they have to personally upload their letter and tie it to your AMCAS ID. So it's a lot more burdensome on your letter writers, in my opinion, to have them to go through all that process and use the AMCAS system, whereas Interfolio takes that whole thing out of the picture. Um, you're in control of when you want to send your letters. And I think that's just really helpful. It's just one less thing that you have to ask your letter writers to do.
Yep. I think it's one of the few things that's worth the investment through this process. Applying to medical school is going to be expensive. Um, and I think this is one of the few things that I would argue is very justified to pay for. Also, you can manually assign your letters and AMCOS to like which schools are going to. And that's something to definitely pay attention to. Like, I think, for example, USC didn't take more than like 5 letters or something like that. I don't remember if it was, I think it was USC, but it may have been another school. So, like, make sure you're not just like clicking every single letter and being like, okay, I'm gonna send everything. Like that school, like if an admission officer looks at that, like don't give them a dumb reason, like, oh, they sent too many letters for them to reject you. Like, oh, they don't care and they didn't read instructions. Um, yeah. So I think those are the big logistics things. Do you have any other comments?
Yeah, I was just going to tag on that a little bit too. Yeah, actually, it's worth paying attention to see which school, like, yeah, don't just click on every letter. Um, I think, like you said, an admissions officer might be like, oh my gosh, this person can't follow directions. We only wanted 4 letters and he uploaded like 6 or 7. It's not going to be the end of the world, but, you know, just an extra reminder to make sure you read every school's policies as far as the number of letters that they want and what types of letters too. Um,
Yes. Yes. Don't upload sex science letters when they want a humanities letter. Um, so, all right. Well, with that being said, I don't have any final comments. Do you, Noah?
no, yeah, I think obtaining letters of recommendation, I think for me was actually one of the more stress inducing parts of the process, just because going into it, I never really fielded letters of recommendation before, at least for something this important. Um, So I wouldn't stress too much about it. You've made connections through your college, and if you're non-traditional, through your actual career. Make use of those connections, be courteous, be kind. Um, some one last tidbit that I don't think we touched on. Some people have advocated like when you ask using the word write a strong letter. Um, I think that's useful if, especially if it's been a while. Um, you don't want a super generic letter, but I think for the most part, anybody who's willing to write you a letter is only going to have good things to say, like Eleni had said previously. So those are just kind of my last parting words of wisdom: is don't fret too much about it. Be prompt, be on time, be courteous, and it's not the end of the world. It's all going to be okay.
Oh, also, don't ask to read your letters. Like you should not be reading your letters before you submit them. That's just like a big conflict of interest. And like I had one letter writer who's a British doctor write their letter for me and then email it to me. And I had to be very like intentional. And I was like, hey, I cannot read this. Luckily she just sent me a copy and she had already uploaded it. So it wouldn't have mattered anyways. But like I think it's important to be not most know, like I think 99% know of US professors that you're not going to read your letters, but it's a conflict of interest. So make sure that you're not asking to read them or that kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Very important. Don't read your letters before you submit them, and even afterwards. Like Eleni said, it's a conflict of interest. The nice part about Interfolio, as if we haven't plugged Interfolio enough, when you
We are
set up
not
your
paid
account.
reps, by the way. We are not paid reps.
Yeah, we are we are not we were not paid to say any of this. This was just purely from my really good experience from both of our really good experiences with them. When you set up your account, you can actually mark your letters as confidential when you set up your account, and then you never have to see it again. So when your professor, doctor, whoever uploads your letter, you don't have to worry about potentially seeing it. It's locked behind a firewall, and you don't have to worry about like I said, you don't have to worry about it not being confidential, and then it's uploaded in the AMCAS when you do so. So that's another really nice part if that's something that you're worried about.
Cool. All right. Thanks, guys. Thank you for listening to the Doctor and Duo podcast. We'll be back next time. I think our next topic is the MCAT. So that's going to be definitely a big, chunky episode. So we'll have lots of good information and that, listening what to do from Noah and listening what not to do from me. So we'll see you guys next time. If you enjoyed this episode, give us a like, follow, subscribe, whatever the affirmative action is on your platform of choice. And we look forward to seeing you in the next episode.